Good morning, everyone. Welcome to PAX South. It is VR Storytime, aka words out of the face hole of me, the VR reckoning, or something. There's my face, really big. My name is Alex Schwartz, and I'm the CEO, the Chief Executive Owl of Owlchemy Labs. Also the chief scientist and also janitor of Owlchemy. That was kind of a joke title in the early days, but then it turned way too real and now continues to be part of the thing that I need to do. So we are a 23-person VR studio based out of Austin, Texas. And we built some crazy stuff in VR over the years, but before that, we built some crazy stuff in not VR. And we've been around for 7 years. And if you remember Smuggle Truck or Jack Lumber or Discourse, that was us before we dove into VR in the early days. And we were also recently acquired by Google. It's a super huge honor to be working with a company who really gets VR. So it's been quite a ride. And so we built a game called Job Simulator. It was a launch title. Thank you. It's a launch title for essentially VR. We were day zero on all 3 of the major VR platforms, the Vive and Oculus Touch and PlayStation VR. We shipped in the box with the Vive. It just became this popular game to kind of show off what could be done with virtual reality. And it's easily showable to people. It's easily approachable. We also worked on and built the game Rick and Morty VR, virtual Rick-ality. That was published by Adult Swim, really well received, and super proud to have worked on something that we were all huge fans of the show beforehand, so it's kind of mind-blowing to have built a game based on something that we love so much. So, I mean, you applauded a bit, but could you raise your show of hands if you've played any of those titles that I've mentioned? Awesome. So, I guess for people who have not tried VR, high-end VR, using your hands in virtual reality is pretty nuts. So at Owlchemy, we call this active VR. As opposed to something like passive VR, I guess would be the opposite, where we don't focus on that at all, the idea of not having hand input. So we believe hands is where the magic comes from in virtual reality, and that's kind of what I'm going to dive into a bit. And turns out, in VR, now that you have hands, you can throw a stapler at your boss, and you can eat moldy donuts out of a trash can and vomit all over your desk. And you can apparently mix cream into your coffee, and it will accurately lighten each milliliter of liquid in the cup via complex liquid simulation, because apparently that's what we had to do. So you can see we're utilizing the true full potential of virtual reality to its finest. But honestly, fully tracked VR is mind-blowing, and it's barely tapped what we can do with it. So as far as Owlchemy and our story, how we got here, and how VR has kind of developed, I want to talk about how we've arrived here at this industry. So we actually have a history here at PAX. PAX East 2011 was, we were in the Boston Indie Showcase with a game called Smuggle Truck. And that was because Owlchemy started out in Boston. And we also dressed up as lumberjacks and showed our game Jack Lumber, which was a game about a supernatural lumberjack. A tree killed your granny, and so you're out to get revenge on the forest. That's why you became a lumberjack, of course. So here we are, at Owlchemy in the early days, building games that very few people had heard of, barely, making enough money to survive, bootstrapping. These original PC games and original mobile games, that was our thing. And so you can see it being played on an iPad here. So then the Oculus Rift DK1 Kickstarter happened, and it was this incredible change in tone where we realized something really big was happening. And I think a lot of people recognized that something magical was happening, but didn't really know where it was going to go. But we instantly dropped everything and ported a game that we had actually developed in conjunction with Deja Bond Games called for the awesome, and made Oculus, because that's the pun you would have to make. And we brought it to VR. And we learned a ton. So, I mean, you're diving off of buildings and flying through the air at breakneck speed in virtual reality, trying not to smash against buildings. So, it was early days. I'll say that we learned a lot about what not to do in VR through this project. You could see, like, you're playing with the keyboard to do the input. Again, very early. And so we're traveling around, talking about VR, what we're learning, thinking about it every day. At this point, we're thinking, well, we're making regular games on the side. We're thinking about VR. How do we do this? And we're trying to figure out what our next VR project would be. And then we went to Steam Dev Days, and we had this incredible opportunity to speak about VR and our early experience. It was we called it a Wild West of VR. It's like the things we learned, but all the things we learned what not to do and how to avoid pitfalls and all this. And so there, we're up on stage. There's Joe Ludwig and Michael Abrash and Palmer. And so that's when Valve pulled us into this room in the back and showed us what they call the room demo or the tag room. And so this was, it's hard to describe, but it was almost like a religious epiphany in my brain when I tried this for the first time. Having accurate positional tracking in an entire room where you can move about, that was a huge turning point. It was absurd. And we knew our future from that point was we're only going to work on VR for the rest of for the foreseeable future or forever. And again, that relationship that we had with Valve led to this really amazing opportunity. Valve approached us, and they said, would you like to... Well, first off, they sent an email that said, we bought you a flight, come down to Bellevue and sign this NDA. We can't tell you what's happening. And so we went down there, and they said, hey, we're building a VR headset, and it's what will become the HTC Vive, and we would love for you to try to experiment with what could be possible with it. So, of course, we said yes, and we dropped everything. And since we were actually all working remotely, we flew out to a co-founder and CTO's house, Devin, who lives up in the Arctic tundra of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And we flew out there in January, which is a terrible, like, if you ever have an opportunity to go to Winnipeg in January, don't do it. But we had this hardware, and we were given 1 week to try to make something for a GDC demo that would be shown to a ton of people. And I just want to reiterate how janky this early prototype hardware was. First off, you had 6 separate USB cables tethering you and your controllers and your head back to the computer. If you touch the headset in the wrong spot, like you're taking it off, like you would, it would shock you with an electric charge. There was hot glue all over the headset. It was held together with duct tapes and dreams. But holy crap, did it do the trick for showing us what was possible with high-end tracking. And so, we're in this room, and out comes Job Simulator, right? The premise is, in the future, robots have automated all human jobs, and so you go into a simulator to relive what it was like to job. And so you work as an auto mechanic, or a chef, or an office worker, because those don't exist anymore. And that's not the kind of idea that just emerges out of the ether. It's completely absurd. Literally would be no one's first plan. So it turns out there was a methodical process of arriving at this idea, and I want to kind of unpack that. So we had this perfect storm of opportunity with the DK1 and the DK2 and the hardware becoming available cheaper and more accessible. This opportunity to have a brand new medium was right in front of us. And so at 90 FPS tracking for the head and the hands, that turned out to be extremely important to kind of making this a quality experience. And theoretically, hopefully, this was going to be coming to consumers at a price point. This wasn't going to be an academic experiment. This was going to be a product that would ship at some point. So we thought, yes, let's think about what people are going to want to play in VR. So first step would be, once we get the hardware, we're going to try out the demos that Valve gives us, and we'll go from there. They gave us nothing. We had nothing to play, nothing to try, nothing to test. We had a piece of plastic that went on our head and a empty Unity project. And so now, looking back, I think it's actually one of the major reasons that we went down this path, and so I want to like retroactively thank Valve for not giving us examples to try to draw from. And so, again, we're in this space in Unity, the game engine, and you've got 3 track positions. You've got a hand, another hand, and a head, and they're just moving transforms. And so we're standing in the middle of a room with a black skybox. There's nothing there. And so we thought, well, I guess we need to make a table to put something on. If we're going to build something, I need to like not have to keep reaching to the ground. And so we made a table, and then we put 3 boxes on the table. And one of the first things we did was make it so that you could just really basic, like pick up the box and then let go of the box. And so what happened after we did that was we found ourselves sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, playing with blocks like kids. And no, I really mean it. We were sitting in the middle of the floor with this absurd headset on, building towers and then knocking them over. We were giggling. There were a bunch of adults in a room sitting on a rug just giggling and smacking blocks. And so, yeah, we had a bit of fun. I ended up putting like an egg in a frying pan in a scene, and the physics were really accurate. And so that was it. Hands that affect physics near you. Let's explore that. Let's brainstorm what kind of areas in the world have lots of tchotchkes and grabbable items and stuff that's like within reach. And so we thought, well, a kitchen, that's got lots of things, and maybe a convenience store, you've got lots of items that you can kind of grab and process, and an office cubicle, well, that seems cool. And all the environments led to the fact that because you're you in first person, you're the person acting out this process, and therefore you're doing a job in every one of these environments. And so I opened up a Google Doc and to put all our name, or all of our ideas of like environments, and I put a temp name at the top that was Job Simulator, and the name stuck until ship. So bingo. Actually, a month before we shipped, one of our teammates was asked everyone. They're like, so when are we coming up with the real name of the game? Sorry. So something we didn't really expect was that the magic that emerged from the accurate hand interaction. And so when you have fully tracked VR, some really crazy stuff starts to happen. You pick up the controllers, and you get this thing called hand presence. And hand presence has this technical definition, but it's the phenomenon when your in-game hand representation, whatever you see showing your hands in VR, lines up so well with where your real hands are in life that they become synchronized in your brain as equivalent, one-to-one. They are your actual hands, not someone else's hands or some other objects in VR that you're like controlling. So when your hands actually work without mental effort, something deep down clicks and a magic gets unlocked. It's this whoa dude moment. And it's these natural interactions that we've been doing all our lives, like reaching out and grabbing something, they just work. And so you've been training yourself all your life to reach out and use the world around you and grab things since birth. It's just natural. So the thing that happens is hand-eye coordination just transfers over into VR. So things that you wouldn't like prepare for, your deep brain, like if someone throws a ball at your face and it's coming right toward you, you'll block it just naturally because your hands are your hands and the hand presence kicks in and it's just, that's you. I have to block my face because something's coming toward me. And like the other thing is like items rolling off your counter and you can like go grab it really quick. Or like, this guy who pulls an amazing dad move, catching the cake before it falls off. I could watch these dad skill close call videos all day, by the way. Just one more. I just have to show one more. OK, really, though, this time, this is the last one. Wait for it. It's an amazing save. Yes. Yes. All right. I'm done. Anyway, these skills, like in this video, like you're throwing a potato battery. You have a potato battery in your hand. If you were able to sync that shot in real life from that like 12-foot away recycle bin in real life, it works one-to-one in VR as long as you've got the throwing tied to the proper variables, and it's one-to-one. So the hand-eye coordination, the intuition just comes across in VR. You don't need to do anything. And so my litmus test was, I've been juggling since I was 7 years old. That's just a thing I do. And so it's like, well, without coding anything specific, can I juggle in VR? And so this is from the earliest prototype. There's me juggling, tomatoes in the kitchen. We didn't add anything specific to allow for that. It just worked because the tracking is so good. And so these innate human actions that you do, because you are, if you're in a first-person piece of content in VR, and you have hand presence, you don't anymore feel like you're a character in a video game, like I'm playing as this character or that. You feel like you're playing as you. It is actually you. And so you don't have to think anymore about, well, what button do I hit to crouch in this video game? You just actually reach down and do it. And so the idea is that we're removing abstractions from gaming, because the entire history of video games has been the idea of mapping arbitrary actions to buttons, abstracting them away, right? So when you play enough video games, you kind of forget about the thousands of hours you put into learning and memorizing inputs and understanding how control sticks and buttons, there's this mental load that you have to memorize, that when you hit, X to use a key or B to crouch or Y to jump, that's a mapping to some other method of doing it. But now, if you're moving your hands naturally, we can ditch the abstraction and we can go with natural 3D interactions that are all around you in the world, right? There's a switch on the wall, I can grab it, I can move it down. There's a knob, I could turn it with my hand. And so this opens up a brand new world of accessibility that was never even comprehensible. VR is now the most accessible way to interact with computers that's ever been invented. So I can give Job Simulator to my grandma with no explanation, and she's going to town making sandwiches in the kitchen, and because she's having fun and laughing and throwing things. And then if I handed her an Xbox controller, just the overhead of understanding how that works, it's too much. And so all these things are coming about with the magic of VR. Like, the other part is that even like 3 gray boxes that represent a head and 2 hands can be so expressive that you can actually pick out, oh my God, that is that person. I know that person specifically in the way that they interact. Like, I had a video that I recorded of something in Job Simulator, and my friend was like, I know that was specifically you in that video. Just the 2 hands and the head. Because of the way that you carry yourself, the way that you move your arms, and the way, I could just tell from the head and the micro motions. And so I guess there's all these other things that you hear about every day if you watch a talk about VR. Everyone talks about how the sense of scale is represented in, you get depth cues and you get presence and this emotional connection to characters and empathy. And all of that, I'm going to just kind of skip over all that, even though it's extremely important, because everybody else talks about it. But when it all comes together, you have great tracking, great presence, and you feel like you're really there. And then the frame rate's good enough, and the optics are good enough. All these bars are slightly over where your brain is able to accept the entire experience. Once you get over that threshold of being fooled on enough axes, some really cool stuff starts to happen that seems kind of like black magic. And so a couple good examples is, I guess, I'll use my game, or our game, as an example for a lot of these, just because we've seen so much. We've seen people play it thousands of times. When people eat food in VR, in Job Simulator, they eat a donut, we notice that everyone opens their actual mouth as they do it. It's amazing. So if you ever see anyone play, just watch their mouth as they go eat something. I think it's something deep down in our psyche. It's like, well, I can't eat if my mouth isn't open. It just happens. You don't think about it. Another good one is there's a thing called proprioception. It's knowing where your limbs are in 3D space without needing to look at them. It's why you can touch your nose with your eyes closed, unless you're stupid drunk. So I see people, once they get comfortable in the space and start to understand it, they're in the kitchen, they open a cabinet, and then they're looking away, and they just close a cabinet with their hand. I even saw someone try to close a door with their leg that was open, and legs aren't tracked at the moment in VR, but that level of being sold that world is real is pretty magical. My friend was playing in the kitchen a long time ago, another story, and they broke a bunch of glass, a bunch of wine bottles, and there was like all this glass in the middle of the floor. And she was playing in socks in a living room, and I noticed for the rest of that play session, she kept tiptoeing around the glass that was on the floor because she didn't want to, cut her feet because there's glass everywhere. I was even in Tilt Brush, where you could draw in 3D space, in my living room in the early days, and we were like collaboratively drawing, like adding to this big drawing in the middle of the room. And so there's this huge like 3D drawing in the center of the room, and it's a big open room with no coffee table. And so someone went in to look at it, and they wanted to like get to the other side to add something to it. And so they were like tiptoeing around the edge of the room to try to not hit the drawing. But when you look at them, they're just standing in this empty room. There's nothing there, and yet they're just kind of like squeezing by because they don't want to hit the content's real. Other like magical moments that come out is that once you have the feeling of your own body and agency, people start to do things that are kind of crazy once they have hands, whether it's context appropriate or not. So there's a good video of like how everyone I see plays Batman Arkham VR. So this is somber. If you haven't played it, in the beginning, it's a really like somber, serious moment. And you don the cowl, and it's like, now is your chance to be Batman. And then you get put in front of this mirror, and everyone does the same thing. They're like, oh my God, I have hands. Yes. And it's like dark music playing, and it's supposed to be really serious. And that's, you can't stop people from doing this. In fact, it would be really negative to try to prevent something like this. So, the other example that I see is like, imagine like getting this key. It's like this, you've achieved all these puzzles, and now you get this one final key, and it will unlock the most important door in the game, and then you take it and you just throw it right out the window. Like, every player just wants to play with the system and push the boundaries as hard as they can. And you have to allow for that and expect it. And so I guess all these interactions, if you can do them, they just provide joy. And so that brings me to the idea of interaction disappointment. So we build these systems to allow for natural interactions in VR, and we work through tough design problems and do all this work to make it so it feels natural. And then something I see in so many VR games is that instantly turns off users from wanting to explore and play is what I call interaction disappointment. And so it must be avoided at all costs, and I'll try to explain it. Think about a traditional game and an environment that gets built for a traditional game. So a level designer is building this world. They're placing items in this world. They put a bunch of props down. They're filling out the world to make it feel interesting. And so the environmental world building is like, well, there's a desk. There should be a cup on the desk, because clearly whoever was sitting there was drinking something. And so, but if you grab for that mug, now you're in VR. Now you have hands. If you went and grabbed for that mug and it didn't actually let you pick it up, that is insanely disappointing. And so it's almost hard to explain how disappointing that moment is. It's like the idea that you're a baby and you're dangling a toy above the baby and it's just out of reach, and we're all just barely functioning children inside of adults' bodies anyway. So really, like, we're getting bummed out because we're slightly bummed out, but our inner child is like crying. And so we found that everything that looks like it should be interactable needs to be interactable. But here's the really messed up part. It also has to be right. And it's like, well, what does that even mean? It has to be that the item aligns with your worldview of how the entire item functions, how it operates, and everything you've known about that item. So if you have this cup, and then you go in this VR game and you couldn't pick up the cup, and then they're like, OK, fine, we'll model the cup, we'll add the collider, we'll make it a thing you can pick up. Cool. You're going to pick up the cup, you're going to walk over to the nearest source of water, and you're going to want to turn a knob and then turn on a faucet or put it under a waterfall or do whatever to fill the cup with water, and then you're going to want to pour the water and drink the water and do all these things because that fits your worldview of how a cup works. And so if it doesn't work in VR, it's crushing. And so as a developer, it leads to this insane rabbit hole of trying to meet every expectation that has ever existed, and now you're starting to simulate the entire universe. And so like these things happen, and they led to some of the magical moments in Job Simulator. For example, plates. We put plates in Job Simulator, and we made them so you could pick them up, because we learned that lesson already. But then I remember my friend went into that was like showing her one of the first moments in our game, and it was early. And she picked up the plate, and she was like, yeah. And she threw it on the ground, and it didn't break. And she was like, this is the worst game ever. That level of disappointment is real. So obviously, plates break now in Job Simulator. The other one is like, all these things led to design moments that you test and you test and you test, and then you find these moments that are amazing, but you haven't done them. So we put glasses on robots. That was the thing. That was part of their costume. And then something we saw over and over is if the robot got close enough, people wanted to grab the glasses off. And so that failed grab is that disappointment, and it's like, well, it didn't work. So we added that to the top of our to-do list, make glasses grabbable. And then once people had the glasses in their hand, they're like, I want to put them on, I want to wear the glasses, I want to do this stuff. And so that led to the process of building a whole system where you could latch glasses onto your face, and then that led to hats that were on bots. You want to wear the hats. And so our whole costuming system was built out of like, OK, we'll do this, OK, we'll do this, OK. And at some point, like, you're building the universe. I think the ultimate example is the liquid in Job Simulator. So we're doing the office, and clearly the joke was like in offices, the first thing people would do is get a donut and coffee. And so we needed to build a fully functioning physics-based liquid simulation that would run at 90 hertz, 90 frames a second. It would do pouring and volume conservation, and you would need color blending because now we're allowing cream. And once you put cream in there, if it doesn't lighten the liquid, then that's terrible. And so it also, the liquid tracks per milliliter its temperature because we're dumb. But actually, it wasn't. It was because of the tea making task that we made in the kitchen later that we needed to add temperature. So it was that the worldview of people who were making tea differed in all these different ways. So we thought, OK, if you just put like hot water that's coming out of a boiling kettle, we'll just mark it as hot or something, and you pour it into something, a vessel. So our formula was hot water plus tea bag equals you've turned the hot water into tea. But some people would put the water from the sink in the kettle, put that on the stovetop, let that boil, pour it in. Some people would put a tea bag in a cup, fill the cup with cold water, take the cup, put it in the microwave, turn the microwave on, expect the microwave to heat up the liquid in the container. And so we got to the point where we needed to support every single situation of like, well, if I had some cold water, some hot water, and it blends, now I have to track the amount of milliliters at this temperature, and I need the room temperature to regulate the hot water so it slowly cools off, and it'll have a smoke particle effect when it's above a certain temperature and all this craziness. So it was pretty absurd, but it all led to having a successful ability to make a joke. So that was useful. We added this robbery scene in the convenience store where a bot would come in, and it would be like, yeah, see, I'm going to give me all your cheddar. And everybody wanted to grab the banana off of the bot. And so we did that, and then we're like, now what? And then we needed to make the banana reappear, and then we had to re-record and get the voice actor to come back and be like, yeah, I always carry an extra banana with me. And then people would like grab the second one, and then we're like, well, now we don't want to repeat the VO line because that's disappointing. So we recorded like 7 different banana grab VOs to make it so that it was not disappointing to people. The level of absurdity here is just cascading. There were some examples where this all fell apart. So if you have too many implied actions to the worldview of an item, it can spiral. So we could never get the knife right. Never noticed there's no knives in Job Simulator. We could have built cuttable items that just like split down the middle into 2 pieces, and the knife, once it touched it, it would just like pop apart. But maybe if you were building like a Cooking Mama type game, that could have worked, and that was the core mechanic. But this is a world simulator. Like, people want to take a piece of paper and slice it in half with the knife. They want to use everything about knives that they see knives doing in real life. So we first implemented actual cutting, and here's what happened. People would sub-chop sub-parts into infinity. And so if you are familiar with the concept of like video game physics and its inaccuracies and rigid bodies getting too close to each other and starting to shake and fall through the table, and then your frame rate tanks because you've got 75 pieces of carrot all interpenetrating. So we're like, we need to solve this. and our first thought was, OK, let's just joke our way out of it. We're going to make a special surprise knife. Surprise, it's a breakable knife. Turns out our goal was to not disappoint people, and that was insanely disappointing. So then we came up with one of the worst ideas we've ever come up with, which was, why don't we build a knife that intentionally avoids items in order to not be cuttable? I want to explain how a video of that does not do justice to the disgusting feeling that you get from seeing like a floppy knife in front of you. And it's terrifying, and I don't ever want to go into that world again. And then there was like trope type, you could joke your way out of some disappointments. So we're building Rick and Morty's, the garage, and there's this video game trope where it's like if you have a doorknob, you have to be able to like open the door, right? Like that's a thing. But we couldn't make the entire Smith household. And so we also couldn't just remove the doorknob from an existing environment that everyone knows has that doorknob. And so in games, it's like remove the knob if it's not accessible, or put a red light on it or something. But we joked our way out of that one. And that's one of my favorite jokes is, you reach for it and you just get real fake doors. And so we did find that certain things, if you break expectations, if you do certain actions, you could break your expectations for the player permanently. So the one I was talking about is like if you fail to grab at something. So if it looks interactable and you reach for it and it doesn't work, and you try that a couple times in a game or an experience and it continually lets you down, at some point you stop grabbing things, right? Like people will just stop trying. They've lost the will to play, the will to explore. The world let them down, and they know that this is just not a place where that can happen. And there's more subtle things that can actually happen, which is like if a game implements something like force grab or Jedi grab, and you're not a character in that world where that makes sense to have magnet hands, what happens is you reach for things, and then you just point at them, and it'll come to you, which is cool. But then the next time you're standing right next to something, and it's just like half a foot away, you have a choice in your brain as to whether I'm going to step forward a tiny bit and grab it with my real hand, or whether I'm just going to go, and then let it snap into my hand. And so you end up just using the force grab because it's the shortcut that you've given to the player, and now that becomes the de facto. So everyone remembers Wii Bowling, right? Like, first, everyone starts playing Wii Bowling with like amazing form, and they're just really going for it. And then you see someone who's like been playing Wii Bowling for a lot, and they just keep like flicking their wrist sadly because you realize the accelerometer in the Wiimote actually doesn't really know too much about your motion, and it just kind of is waiting for that rotation. And so, yeah, once you have real tracking, we have this medium, this VR medium, where we can make those shortcuts not possible. And that sounds limiting, but it's actually, you can, in most content, that's going to be more fun, depending on what you're doing, to mime the full action and have that be required than to have a crappy shortcut. So we actually did this in Job Simulator, is that you can force motion with no shortcuts possible. In this level, we purposely put the fridge and the delivery plate on opposite sides of the room, and they're just far enough apart that in order to grab items from that pantry or fridge, I have to move my body to go over there. So if everything were accessible with my hands, people would not move their feet. And it turns out playing in VR while moving your feet is actually more fun. So we have all these little tricks that we've found. Some of them work, some don't. But that make complex interactions seem really intuitive, and that no one has to learn anything special, and it just works. And it's very straightforward. And the reason we have to use these tricks, though, is that, and build gamey solutions to problems, is that we have a major disconnect in VR, is that hand interaction, you lose the actual pushback of hitting against real items. So real-world surfaces push back against you, and you don't have that in VR. So your hands are ghosting through everything that you do. You can move through anything. It's just, there's no physical item blocking your hand, so there's nothing we could do. But you can start thinking about, well, what if the in-game representation stays somewhere, but then my real hand went through the table, but But then imagine the idea that you see your hand in one spot, and your real hand's in another spot, and your proprioception says, that's not my hand, and then you break the hand presence magic, and now you're really screwed. And so we came up with this idea where the item that's in your hand actually has permanence, and it will break out of the grip of your hand on impact. So it's this complicated system using joints and physics, but when you do it right, the table feels so damn real. And so to the point that people actually will lean on the virtual table and there's nothing there and like possibly fall over. And I've had moments where I'm like coming out of VR and clearly I'm realizing like this was VR and it's fine. But I take my controllers and I put them down on the virtual table. But all I did was just drop them in the air and they fell to the ground. And so it's, again, this really happens. It's pretty magical. Like little things behind the scenes, like one of the secrets we've found, it's not a big secret, but like thing you don't really realize when you're playing is that you could use the vibration motor in the controllers to rumble at certain times, and it's more accurate than like when you think like an old Xbox controller spinning a magnet. It's very accurate haptics on a Vive controller or a touch controller, and you can simulate friction of a handle pulling or rotating or a drawer slowly sliding open, like this slushy machine. The handle, when you pull it, each degree kind of does like a bit of a click, and so you get this like feeling as you turn it, and it's dependent on the speed and all these things, and it just adds this 10% to the back of your brain. You're not realizing my hand's shaking or vibrating. You're just feeling like that felt really good to do, and it felt more real. So this whole process is super weird, and we're just all figuring it out. No one really knows what they're doing. But I guess a little more about like how we approach the design of this is that designing intuitive interactions just involves testing over and over and over and over with people to see if it works. But you can think of your hands more like mitts, like uncoordinated mitts in a sense. And so the natural analog is more like how Fisher-Price designs toys for small children. And so we found ourselves walking through toy stores and looking at how things are designed for toddlers. And a good example is like our blender in Job Simulator. Like, show me a blender that has a slot machine arm on it. That is not a thing. That doesn't exist. But when you look at that, you know exactly what you're supposed to do because it affords the proper interaction. And we're not going for abject realism. We're going for large, simple actions that are easily read. And real blenders just have this, tiny clustered buttons that you need to like have a lot of sub-finger accuracy. And you've got these big mitts, so you have to think differently. It's kind of like the old Simpsons joke of like, your finger's too fat, you need a special dialing wand. So like and even when you approach something like a menu, like menus have always existed in games. People just assume that you need a menu, and we needed a way to get back to the original starting point in the game, like to go back to the menu. So we thought, okay, we're going to need to implement something, and putting a 2D plane of how we've always thought of menus, like this abstraction, seemed like a step back, right? Like we're trying to remove abstractions in VR, and now we're adding something that is, again, like from this old world. And so we thought, well, what if we just try to use whatever in-world actions exist for us? Like maybe you could hit something, like you ring a bell and that's your menu, and so someone comes over, or you could throw, so there would be like a menu target, and you got to hit it. And then if you hit that, it spawns the menu or something. Or you go back to the menu. Or like a button on the wall, it's like, like pulling the fire alarm or something. And so one of the ideas that came out of that was this idea to combine all the verbs that you could do in the game into one like bop-it of interactions. And that turned out to be a terrible idea. It was really confusing and awkward. But it led to this weird experimentation that finally resulted in what we call the exit burrito. So the exit burrito is when you hit a button, a suitcase comes out of nowhere, and you open it up, and inside of that suitcase is your menu. And so you have your choice to exit, and you look at it, and you eat, and then you eat it again, and you are teleported back to the museum, back to where you started. And so when you hit quit in a game, you hit quit and it says, are you sure you want to quit? Like having to eat it twice is this perfect two-stage confirmation, and like it really caught on, and then other video games were using the exit burrito as this we were like, it's a cultural phenomenon, or at least we were telling ourselves that. But like, it's this good, weird, memorable lesson of trying extremely hard to abandon what the traditional way is to do something and try to not use prior design in VR. And even like with spaces and how we laid out spaces, we did that. We tried to think differently about the space design. So everything's reachable in Job Simulator so that you don't have to like locomote. And so we approached all of our level designs in like this hard mode where we didn't just build the level, we redesigned it multiple times depending on the size of space available to you in your living room or whatever space you're doing your VR. So we take the calibration data and then we determine, are you in a smaller room, and we go to the small version, or a medium-sized room or a large room. And so you could see as I flip through these images that like the models are swapping, they're being repositioned. In fact, things are being removed from the counter to save on real estate in the small one. And then we put those items into these things called tool choosers, which is like essentially like an infinite cabinet of new appliances that you could pull up on demand that saves space. So we just kind of, that was the way for us to approach that. Like even in Rick and Morty VR, that happens in a slightly more complicated way because the garage is this one big garage, but there's different areas of the garage that could be teleported to. So you can see there's 1, 2, 3 zone type areas. And each of those areas gets independently scaled to make it so that if you're in small, you could reach everything like you'd want to, and that everything fits within your bounds in your room, so you're not ever feeling like, ugh, I can't reach this thing. And so I guess to summarize what I'm trying to get at with how VR is being approached is that it's a brand new medium, and it's really, really hard to try to build from the ground up. And it takes so much time, and it's really important. And I think actually the biggest mistake being made today in VR design is building for the past. And I guess what I mean by that is like using paradigms that existed from prior mediums and just assuming that because it's been done a certain way in the past, that that should apply in this brand new medium. By the way, I just want to point out that like when we were living off of ramen in the early days, we were hoping that one day we could become a real company. The only difference is that now I can afford to get great stock photography for my presentations. So that's really the only delta between then and now. So anyway, like I get it. It's really hard. It's really expensive to try, and like seemingly completely absurd to try to build new stuff from the ground up just for VR, right? Like if you're trying to make money and not go out of business and make a company and build content, you might think, well, why don't I just make a regular game? There's millions and millions of people with that, the ability to play those, and then I'll add like a VR mode support, and that's a nice like easy way to ease into VR. But it turns out that that's just not as helpful. It doesn't make for quality content. And I guess the good news is that this is a phenomenon that has happened in brand new mediums before, and it slowly gets better. Take mobile, for example. So mobile's a great example of an early market where developers did not embrace the strengths of the platform from the beginning. It was like, OK, we've got this new phone. We're going to just take all the stuff that we used to play and try to jam it onto a phone. And that's how you end up with the travesty that is virtual buttons on an iPhone. And so it took years, actually, for developers to start to embrace and think, well, what is it that I could build from the ground up that takes advantage of a touchscreen? Like, what is great about touchscreens and this form factor and Tiny Wings and Flight Control and Angry Birds and all these great pieces of content that actually embrace the platform? They came years after the start. And the beginning was just poor ports of existing content and existing interactions shoehorned into a brand new medium. And it's so easy to just say, you know what, let's just convert a big 60-hour game to VR by attaching a VR camera to a moving character. Let's just put Call of Duty into VR, and it's just going to be profit. So there's other ways to think of it. All these people are approaching VR and saying, well, I don't get it. How are we going to move around a space if I don't have that much room to move? And it's like, how do we get around existing content? How do we move around existing stuff? And people are hitting their heads against the walls with artificial locomotion and just holding forward in the game. And it can make people sick, and allowing teleportation anywhere in a world that's already been built. These are ways to bolt on motion to something that's been built for a previous platform, a previous medium. And so In general, should we be starting with these constraints of, like, how do we shoehorn in? What if we flip the problem and say, how do we build a design from the ground up that takes the strengths and limitations of VR and embraces them and leans into them and does something brand new for the platform? And I think that is very possible, and now is the time to be doing that. But again, it takes time, money, and lots of iteration to create new things. And so my challenge to people making things is I want to challenge developers to be building new experiences, new methods of interaction. And it's scary and tough and risky. But really, is it that risky? Or is it riskier to build a safe bet and risk being passed over as more of the same? And honestly, for players, I want to challenge players to pay attention and embrace innovation and strangeness and to know the creators who are making the stuff that is coming out. And to use the one lever that you really have control over, which is to vote with your wallets for things that you want to see. Because I think in the end, as we look back from many years from now, back on this time, it's going to be really hard to argue that anything but the fact that content that will stand the test of time is the content that really only worked and could only be experienced in VR. Thank you.